Welcome to the AERA SIG Complexity Theories in Education winter webinar, which is titled The Complexities of Capturing Teachers' Learning and Identity Development. One of the reasons that we're doing this webinar today is because we want to build community among the folks that are interested in complexity theories in education. So we hope that you'll take advantage of this opportunity to network with each other, have a chat with each other, and hopefully continue some of those conversations moving forward. We actually have several more webinars planned for 2022 and spring 2023. You can follow our newsletter if you're a member of the SIG. You can watch out for our announcements, and you can also follow us on Facebook. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our wonderful presenters today. We have Dr. Carla Geveke from the Hansa University of Applied Sciences in the Netherlands. Her research is part of the Curious Minds program. She started this research in 2006, looking at children's reasoning talents in science and technology education and teachers' talents to stimulate these young children's talents. This year, Carla will finish her postdoc research into stimulating talented behaviors of students with the need for their support in interaction and communication in the context of science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics education. I am thrilled to welcome Carla to our webinar, and then after Carla has presented, we have a shared presentation from several researchers in the Philadelphia area in the United States. So we have Dr. Avi Kaplan, Wendy Chan, and Joey Eisman. Avi is a professor of educational psychology at Temple University's College of Education and Human Development. His research focuses on motivation and identity in educational contexts. Wendy Chan is an assistant professor of education at the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education, and her research focuses on statistical methods to improve generalizations from small studies to inform the scaling up of interventions. And Joey Eisman is a doctoral student of educational psychology at Temple University's College of Education and Human Development, and his research focuses on emotions and creativity in motivation and identity. I'm Joanna Garner, I'm the SIG chair, and I am so happy to have Serena Cinnamon, who is our outgoing Secretary-Treasurer, in the driving seat for our webinar today. We also have Heather Williams, who's our program chair for the SIG, on the call as well. So thank you very much to the SIG Executive Committee for helping to put this together. And thank you to UNC Pembroke for hosting today's webinar. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Carla.
Well, thank you very much, Joanne. I'm very excited to present here. Thank you very much for inviting me. As Joanne introduced me, I am a lecturer and a PhD at the Department of the Teacher Education of the Hansa University of Applied Sciences. My name is Carla Geveke, and my talk today will be about teaching and learning processes in the out-of-school science activities for elementary schools. My focus will be particularly on pedagogical content knowledge, which is traditionally seen as a stable property of a teacher. Today, I will present PCK, pedagogical content knowledge, from another perspective, namely the complex dynamic system approach to PCK, which we then have defined as expressed pedagogical content knowledge. The outline of my talk will be, first I will say something about pedagogical content knowledge, PCK, in out-of-school science activities, and then I will show the theoretical framework of a dynamic perspective on expressed pedagogical content knowledge. I will show you the research question of this specific study I present today, which is the development of an instrument which can track EPCK, the EPCK coding scheme, and I will show you the construct and process validities, what you can see when you use this instrument to measure expressed pedagogical content. The method I used was a principal factor analysis. In the results, I will show you which factors we found and how these factors are distributed over time. And then I will show you the conclusions and the discussions and some practical implications, which are very nice to know when you guide teachers in their professional development, for instance, coaching. I did my PhD research on science activities outside school, so out-of-school science education. And my dissertation was called It's Not Rocket Science, and this talk specifically focused on one of the studies, which is also published in International Journal of Complexity in Education, which is the head of the editors are, for instance, Koopmans, which will be also in this SIG business event you will organize. Schulman was the first person who introduced pedagogical content knowledge, and he defined it as ways of presenting and formulating the subject content that make it comprehensible to others. And often this is examined by means of questionnaires and paper and pencil tests. So this is the knowledge that teachers should possess. PCK is knowledge that the teacher has about the content, but not only about the content, also about ways of introducing the content to students, but he also needs to know what problems students can have when dealing with the subject. Out-of-school science activities are activities outside of the school, education taking place during school hours and according to the school curriculum, but using learning sources and educational environments outside the physical buildings. So, for instance, a visit to a science center or a mobile planetarium, which is in the middle, the picture in the middle, or a museum, or anything what's outside of the school but is related to science education. So why is it so important to have outside of learning activities? Science activities out of a school are most of the time very interesting and stimulating curiosity, and that is very necessary for interest in science, for maintaining a sustainable society, and have, for instance, to find solutions for global issues as we find them today, COVID problems or Ukraine and Russia. We need to solve these problems, poverty, have clean water in the future. So it's very, very important that we find students' interest for these subjects of science. And out-of-school science learning is very important, as formal education is not sufficient enough for developing these creative problem-solving skills. So these out-of-school science activities are very meaningful, and students can learn more than from textbooks only. PCK is traditionally conceived as a construct which is inside the teacher, but PCK is also shaped by interactions with students in real-time interaction. But PCK is most of the time measured with static methods like questionnaires, which contradicts the basics of the complex dynamic systems. A complex dynamic system has the following properties. It consists of multiple components that mutually influence each other, and together they form a process. So PCK is a process. It means that all components in this process play an interactive and constituting role in this process and act as a particular part of PCK. Multiple influencing components form a process. Also, a property of a complex dynamic system is that timescales are interconnected. So on the short-term timescale of the interaction in the here and now, from moment to moment, is connected to interactions on the long-term scale. So PCK is soft assemblage, so like put together in the real-time interaction, but also is related to the long-term scale. So it is the result of interactions in the past and will somehow be of influence of the interactions in the future. And the third and the fourth property of a complex dynamic system is nonlinearity and variability and the forming of attractor states as a result of self-organization of complex dynamic systems. PCK is an emergent property of many coupled of interacting variables, so these multiple components which mutually influence each other. And these couplings of variables fluctuate, so have a lot of variability over time. And these couplings self-organize in a relatively stable state, which some of these states can be attractor states. So this is an attractor state. The system falls into these states time and time again. Traditionally, PCK is a mental property inside the teacher, and we will have other definition, which is expressed pedagogical content knowledge. And Expressed Pedagogical Content Knowledge from the complex dynamics perspective is then a pedagogical content knowledge that emerges, develops, and acts in the form of real-time interaction in a concrete educational context. That is to say that it takes place in the form of a particular content-oriented activity and interactivity between teachers and their students as the result of a dynamically co-constructed process. So not only insight, not only like a stable property of a teacher, but dynamically constructed in the interaction between students and the teacher. In this study, we wanted to build a coding scheme to observe express pedagogical content in knowledge in real-time interaction, but therefore we needed to know what the literature says about what is qualitatively good science teaching. These are the theoretical components we found in the literature, and we used these components to build an instrument. First component is that the interaction should be content-based, which is not often done. There are some moments in the lessons when the teacher or the students are not on task, but off task. First thing we have to look for is what moment in the lesson is the discussion content-based. The second is the teaching style. We know for one thing that an open teaching style in which the teacher asks open questions encourages students to speak, show more complex answers. That's the result of a more open teaching style when the teacher asks questions and follow-up questions. And one part of PCK that is very important is that teaches knowledge of misconceptions of students and how to anticipate and respond on that. Knowing how to respond, ask for applying the correct instructional strategy, which should be more open. However, the teacher can be more open, but mainly focused on declaration. So traditionally, teachers ask a lot of those kind of declarative knowledge questions, but the teacher should be more focused on conceptual understanding, a type of knowledge that is deeper than declarative knowledge. And if students contribute more to the interaction, the concepts students have of the world will be expressed. Therefore, the teacher should provide autonomy to the pupils so that they can react spontaneously or ask questions and contribute to the content that is discussed. Last three components are student related. Students can express a level of complexity in their knowledge and skills. For instance, they can show declarative knowledge or conceptual knowledge or no complex knowledge or skills. For instance, they only respond with yes or no, or they only describe what they see. Students' contribution can be spontaneous or non-spontaneous, and the conceptions can be misconceptions or correct conceptions or fragmented conceptions. What we did was we used one case. We choose this case on basis of global observations. We had several recordings, video recordings, and we chose this case because the educator was highly ranked by global observations with 2 observers, and we choose this one because this educator showed fairly enough high level EPCK. And this case was an activity in a mobile planetarium. This is an inflatable dome in which the solar system can be projected and also galaxies. It's very, very exciting for children to go into this mobile planetarium. This was a class of 25 students from grade 3. We had this videotaped activity and we coded the first 700 seconds with our coding scheme. We did the coding in 3 steps because there were a lot of variables to code. We made time series. With the time series, we made a factor analysis to reduce on the number of variables. We had 26 variables and we reduced it to 4 factors. As you can see, the coding scheme used the theoretical EPCK components for the coding schemes. For the coding scheme, on the left you see those theoretical EPCK components, and on the right you see the variables. And the bold variables are related to high-level EPCK. We did it in 3 coding rounds. So this is the first coding round. So we first coded the content-focused activity, the teaching style, and the student's level of complexity. And then we coded teachers' reactions and the students' contributions. And then we coded the reactions to those conceptions and the students' conceptions. We coded on the moment that the utterance started, and we coded when the utterance ended. So it was a real-time coding. The reliability of the coding schemes was between 85% and 100%. Corresponding kappa are 77% and 100%. So when we had coded the data, we conducted a factor analysis with the coded time series. We used the 4 factors to reduce on the total amount of variables. So now we had 4 factors, which explains 62% of the data. The first factor is in yellow, the second in green, and the third in black, and the fourth in orange. You see on the right the correlating variables. So every variable which is correlated more than 0.50 describes the factor. The S means student and the T means teacher. The first factor can be described as controlled, correct, declarative knowledge. The second as open teaching focused on complex thinking and conceptual understanding. The third can be described as close initiative from the teacher. And the fourth can be described as spontaneous, fragmented conceptions, neutrally judged, extended by means of explanations by the teacher or not acknowledged by the teacher. These are the 4 factors we found empirically. These are not one-to-one related to the theoretical components. So as you see, these components we found in empirically are teacher related and student. We found that one of the factors particularly can be associated with high-level EPCK. That's the green one. You see a lot of variables which are bold, so high-level EPCK. The construct of validity can be answered as the theoretical components are not in a one-to-one fashion found, but more variables are more distributed over the components when we look at the empirically found components. In terms of process validity, we distributed the factors over the time. You see the times on the x-axis and the factor loadings are on the y-axis. And the figure shows that factor 1 and 2 and 4 occur in forms of peaks. This demonstrates that at certain moments, when the interaction is strongly dominated by EPCK factor, which thereby is representative for the interaction at that moment. And factor 3, on the other hand, is represented over the time in the form of a more flattened line. This means that the factor is present, but not dominating in the conversation. And at the end, it's dropping, clearly showing absence of the closed initiative. So here in the beginning, you see a green peak, and I will show you the conversation in this green peak. The conversation here is green peak, and the green was high level of EPCK. There were a lot of variables correlating with factor, which are high level PCK. The instructor said, so in a little while the sun will drop behind the building, and then it will become dark. And does anyone perhaps know why that happens? Why does it become dark every evening and then light again in the morning when the sun comes up? Yes. A student says, because the earth is turning, and the instructor says, do you also know in what way the earth turns? The instructor says, no. Does it turn? Well, there are 2 possibilities really. Does the earth turn around the sun, or is that the earth spins around itself? The instructor waits, it's a waiting time. The student said, spins around itself. And the instructor said, right, the earth is spinning. It does both really. It circles around the sun and it spins around itself. But it's thanks to the spinning that we have day and night. So you see a lot of conceptual understanding, evoking conceptual understanding, think time. So this is really present here, and you see this is building up. This is a student and a teacher interaction, mutually influencing each other. As a conclusion of the first question about construct validity, does the coding scheme reveal how EPCK, as defined by theoretical components, indeed emerge in real-time interaction? We have found that there are 4 factors, and one of those 4 factors can be associated with high level of EPCK. Empirically found factors are different from theoretically found EPCK components. And these components are constructed by means of intertwined processes by teacher and students. Process validity. Does the coding scheme reveal a process of EPCK emergence that comply with the complex dynamic system theory, with the properties of the theory? The EPCK is locally emergent and a variable process, as we see in those peaks, and it emerges out of coupled interaction variables. And the factors correspond with the various level of EPCK, high and low. So, for instance, the teacher initiative is a low EPCK factor. This transcription also shows that different features of targeted concepts are in EPCK. And self-organization, we did not found this in this study, but we have another study of 9 of those cases. We used also the sector analysis, but we cluster it and we could find attractor states. And attractor states are recurrent with low level of variability and stable for a couple of time, for duration, which is well substantial. This coding scheme for out-of-school activities, it is for out-of-school activities, but it can also be used, we think, within science education within primary schools. And the instrument is supplementary but not exhaustive. So if you have, for instance, another topic, you could add some other variables. Further research is interesting to find attractors, time serial properties related to high level and low level. Of course, we did this in the study which I referred to, which was published in Frontiers. And we do not know which intentions teachers have, so that will be very interesting to find out. When they apply certain teaching strategies, why do they use that? For instance, you can find this out by using vignettes or by commenting on their own videotapes and coded lessons. For instance, when using video feedback coaching. Practical implications, what works, what we see in factor 2 with the high level EPCK. There is a lot of evoking thinking and asking questions, encouraging students to think out loud and provide think time. This is something that works. So not one-to-one, one-way direction of the teacher and the student listen, but asking questions. By asking questions, you can elicit conceptual knowledge, which is important, not only declarative knowledge, but conceptual knowledge is far more deeper knowledge, and provide opportunity to express spontaneity. We saw this in one of the factors, the 4th factor, but the teacher did not respond to those spontaneous inputs. So you should deepen those inputs. Furthermore, during the dynamic teaching and learning process, the teacher must decide when he or she could provide cognitive autonomy. So the teacher cannot be all the time open and ask questions and encourage to show your conceptual knowledge. Sometimes the teacher needs to provide explanations or examples. So the teacher has to decide on the spot. Therefore, it's probably logical that you see different factors speaking up at different moments in the lesson. Within the EPCK coding scheme we developed and we tested, teachers can obtain a representation of which moments in the lesson the quality of the interaction is varied. They can realize when do I use these EPCK high level EPCK in those lessons, and how can I recognize my own high quality teaching learning moments in the lesson? And can I expand those moments to have my lessons of a higher level quality? And learn to influence the interaction at moments when the EPCK is less optimal. When they realize at some moments the EPCK level is dropping down, they can change it by using other strategies which elicit a higher level of EPCK. Takeaway message: EPCK is not an enduring or stable property of teaching and learning, but it is a dynamic property constructed by means of dynamic intertwined process of teacher and student elements. Occurring in the form of sequences of high and low levels, so peaks, corresponding peaks of these latent factors. And these peaks can be detected by using EPCK, which in its turn can change the teacher's teaching.
Thank you, Carla. We just have a couple of minutes for questions. So the question's from Karen Harris, and she says she's curious why the first 700 seconds, slightly less than 12 minutes, were chosen. In many lessons, including when I teach elementary students, it takes a bit of warm-up time to bring everyone into the lesson.
The first moment that the interaction was really content-based, so no get-ready moments were spilled. So we started the coding at the moment the conversation was on content. We compared it with the coding of a whole lesson, and we saw that this moment was representative for the whole conversation. This was an interactive presentation in the mobile planetarium. I can imagine that if you use this for a classroom, when you have an introduction which is more instructional guided, teacher guided, and then you change over to hands-on experiments, that will be very different. So then you have to make other decisions. but this was an interactive presentation of 30 minutes, which we choose to start to code at the moment that the interaction was really on the content.
Thank you, Carla. Now we're going to switch over, and Avi and Wendy and Joey are going to present a complex dynamic systems perspective on teacher learning as identity change, novice social studies teachers learning to facilitate discussion.
Thank you for inviting us to share our work in progress on capturing teacher learning from a complex dynamic system perspective. What we'll present is part of a larger project funded by the James McDonald Foundation, focuses on novice social studies teachers learning to facilitate discussions in the high school classroom. And this is a collaboration between a team at the University of Pennsylvania and a team at Temple University. And I'd like to acknowledge our team members. Our PIs, Avi Eisman and Tim Patterson, co-PIs, Wendy Chan and myself, our postdocs, Jenny Conrad, Lightning J, and AJ Shiera, and our doctoral students, Joey Eisman and Andy Del Calvo. In this talk, we'll describe our emerging approach to capturing our participants' dynamic engagement in one part of our project, a summer week-long professional development institute. We'll begin by describing the complex dynamic system perspective or theoretical model that is guiding our approach. Then we'll describe the context of the project summer PD. And then we'll describe our emergent approach to capturing the participants' learning as identity change in the PD. The theoretical model guiding our project is the dynamic systems model of role identity, or we like to refer to it by its acronym DSMRI. And the model explains motivation, engagement, action, and learning as emerging from the person's situated social cultural role, such as student or teacher or PD participant. A social cultural role constitutes a shared cultural schema about the role. Now, each person's interpretation of that social cultural role constitutes that person's role identity, and it frames that person's interpretation of the situation, themselves in that situation, and their decision-making in that situation. The DSMRI is based on the central premise or intuitive understanding that from moment to moment, a person acts to achieve goals in the situation in light of their interpretation of the situation and themselves within that situation. For example, a teacher take certain instructional moves to pursue instructional goals in light of their interpretation of the classroom situation and their own positioning in that classroom situation. And the DSMRI conceptualizes the role identity as a complex dynamic system with four main systemic components, each with multiple elements and emotions that rise and ebb as time goes by. One component is the person's interpretation of the situation, their ontological and epistemological beliefs about that situation. In other words, what the person holds as true about the situation and their perception of those beliefs. For example, how certain or complex these beliefs are. The second component is the purpose and goals in their role, what they're trying to achieve for themselves and for others in that situation. The third component is the person's self-perceptions or self-definitions in the situation, which include their self-efficacy, their values, their personal interests, and their social identities. And the fourth component is the person's perceived action possibilities, or the action that the person perceives as available or not available for them to pursue their goals in light of their beliefs about the situation and of themselves, their self-perceptions and self-definitions in that situation. These four components constitute a dynamic system. They are interdependent, and together they constitute the system of the person's emergent situated role identity. And this role identity in the DSMRI is conceptualized to emerge within the framing of four control parameters. One control parameter is the person's unconscious dispositions. The second control parameter is the subject domain within which the role is situated. The third control parameter is the social context and social interactions and positioning in that situation. The fourth control parameter are the cultural tools, the tangible and semiotic tools that mediate the emergence of the role identity components and their relations. Now, the DSMRI has three facets. It has a content facet, it has a structure facet and it has a process facet. The content facet concerns the type of knowledge, beliefs, the type of goals, the type of self-perceptions, and the type of action possibilities that are salient to the person in the role in the situation. Structure facet concerns the harmony or alignment and tensions within that role identity between the elements and the components of the system. The process concerns the ways by which this role identity forms and transforms, how the content and structural relations are changing, and whether it is towards enhanced alignment and order or towards disorder and entropy. When we think about learning, we see that change as reflecting learning, that learning reflects certain types of change in the role identity, in its content, in its structure, and in the nature of its process of formation. Now, more specific to the context of PDs, professional development, from the DSM-RI perspective, any PD has two focal role identities. That of the PD participant, that participants occupy during the PD, and the other is the role identity of the professional, like teacher, which in the participants commonly don't occupy that role identity in the context of a PD. So they need to imagine it while they're occupying the PD participant's role identity. From this perspective, the goal of the PD is to design participants' experiences of the role identity as PD participant that would promote their focus on change in the role identity beyond the PD context, that of a teacher. I'm going to pass on the speaker role to Joey, who will describe the context of our Summer PD Institute.
Thank you, Avi. So to explore discussion, facilitator role identity development, and learning, we invited 15 novice social studies teachers to a week-long PD experience as part of a larger research project. In this context, as Avi noted, the goal is really for participants to change their teacher role identity in ways that are aligned with the goals of the PD. Specifically for us, it was to develop a richer and more integrated role identity as discussion facilitators. Here you can see it's a display of our PD schedule, which took place over 5 days and included a diverse set of activities. Some of these activities were more theoretical in nature, like when our participants learned about the DSM-RI. Another theoretical activity was really focused on having our participants learn what is a quality discussion, or the dimensions of quality discussions. Other activities were practice-focused or practice-oriented and involved things like demos of discussions in which our teachers participated. And then following the demos, the participants then planned their own discussions. The participants then led their planned discussions with real students, similar to a practicum experience. Then we had 10 content-based activities in the PD. Our attempt to capture their engagement and identity processes included administering a brief survey at the end of each of these activities, which you can see highlighted in red. We also did administer day-level reflections at the end of each day, and also a final reflection at the last day of the PD. However, that data is beyond the scope of this talk, so here we're really only focused on the activity level measures and our attempt to capture the dynamics of participants' engagement and identity processes across the diverse activities. And to talk more about the data, I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Wendy.
Okay, thank you. To understand the participants' experiences, we collected both quantitative and qualitative data using a Qualtrics survey that included 4 items with rating scales, which are in this slide here. For these 4 items, we asked the participants to rate their levels of engagement, efficacy, value, and perceived cost using a scale that ranged from 1, which represented not at all, to a score of 10, which represented high level. And in addition to these 4 items, we also asked 3 open-ended questions where participants were asked to describe the high point and the low point of the activity and how they might redesign this activity for next year's Summer Institute. To begin our analyses, we started with the quantitative responses from the survey and plotted the responses using a time series graph, such as the one that is depicted here, in which we have on the x-axis the 10 activities, and the y-axis shows the scores for each of the activities based on the ratings. And in this plot, we have box plots for the scores that capture the variability as well as the range that we saw in the overall data. Now, in practice, one of the common ways to begin an analysis like this is to look at the aggregate or the average viewpoint. In the next slide, we plotted the average scores across all the participants for each of the 4 items in the Qualtrics survey. And the solid lines that are in each of the graphs connect the median scores for 10 activities so that we can see what were the overall trend across the participants. From these 4 plots, we see that these scores at the aggregate level suggest a overall positive and uniform motivation across most of the activities. And the only exception is cost, in which we see some variability. But looking at scores from the aggregate level is not the only viewpoint that we can take. We can also look at how the trends look at subgroup levels to see if there are any discerning patterns in terms of variability and differences that we wouldn't have seen at the aggregate level. One of the subgroup viewpoints that we took on was to see whether there were differences in trends, in this case between the female identified and the male identified participants. These 2 box plots are based on the scores for the engagement item. We can see that when we look at aggregation by subgroups, we see a lot more variability and a more divergent picture of motivation across the activities. Another subgroup that we can also look at is based on program. And here, when we look at the trends in costs broken down by program, we also see patterns of variability and divergence that, again, we would not see at the overall aggregate level. And then finally, if we look at the individual level and look at the time series plots for the scores for each person, we see even more variability that reflects some of the unique patterns, in this case of engagement, across the activities. And in particular, we see that for some individuals, there's almost complete uniformity, such as the graph that's given in the top right. But for others, such as the one given in the bottom, there's a lot more diversity and variability in the pattern that reflect the individual's unique experiences during the week-long PD. I'm going to turn it back to Avi for the remaining presentation.
Thank you, Wendy. This finding that the individual diversity of the quantitative patterns showed things that the aggregates did not show highlighted the unit of analysis of the person in context. And we followed these analyses by combining the individual time series of the motivational variables with the qualitative analysis using the DSMRI of the participants' responses to the open questions. And the analysis involved first, as you can see in the table, first looking to identify the role identities that were highlighted in participants' responses, the 4 role identities they focus on, and then using qualitative content analysis to code for the role identities content, structure, and process. For example, participant KV focused on the role identity of PD participant in the first 4 activities. And then we use codes like OB for ontological beliefs, EB for epistemological beliefs, SP for self-perceptions, G for goals, etc. And then green, highlighting green for indications of alignment and red for tensions to code for the content of those role identities. As another example, see participant RA, who focused on the role identity of the PD participant and also on the role identity of teacher in the first 4 activities. The coding of their responses included coding for content, structure, and process in both of these role identities, the participant and the teacher. So this then allows us to combine the scores indicating the participants' motivational dynamics with the insights into the role identities that they focused on and the content, structure, and processes of these role identities in each activity. And here you can see the analysis of KV's data across the 10 activities, although this participant did have one missing data in one activity. So by combining the motivational scores and the DSMRI analysis, we can create a narrative about the participants' nature of role identity engagement and its dynamic change from activity to activity. This then allows us to also compare view of the success of the PD in eliciting different participants' engagement with their imagined teacher role identity. So compare, for example, this data analysis, KV's data analysis, which throughout the PD focused only on the role identity of the PD participant and involved both alignment and quite a bit of tension, as you can see within that role identity. Compare this with RA's data, which highlighted the continuous focus on both participant and imagined teacher role identities, with mostly alignments manifesting within these 2 identities. And notably, indications of change, which this participant explicitly labeled as learning in the imagined teacher role identity in the last 2 activities, providing evidence for success in, at least in this case, of the goal of the PD. In summary, our emerging approach for capturing PD participants' learning as identity change provides a view of PD learning as emergent, situated, and dynamic at the unit of analysis of the participant in context. And in our current case, we elected to focus on the level of the PD activity as the time unit of analysis. As Carla mentioned before, these time scales are related to each other. And the findings suggest that the participants manifested unique role identity dynamics across the activities. We also learned about the limitations of our data, and we're now considering how to change our measures so they capture the kind of data we're interested in to be able to get a more in-depth picture of participants' role identity engagement and processes. And finally, our analysis emphasizes that both the measures and the PD activities themselves should be designed with the intention to scaffold personal and social identity exploration of the target role identity, the imagined role identity of the professional, in our case, the teacher discussion facilitator. And for further information, please feel welcome to write to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Avi and Wendy and Joey. We have time for one question. I see Diane Lawson-Friedman has raised her hand.
Thanks for the presentation, the two presentations, both very interesting. My question for Avi and Wendy and Joey has to do with, you say measures didn't quite work for your purposes and you want to change them in some way on the next iteration of your study. The question is, what didn't work? Why didn't they work? And what are you intending to do that far ahead in your thought? Thank you.
Thank you, Diane, for your question. It's not that they didn't work completely. They worked. As you could see, we have valuable insights into our participants' role identity dynamics. But what we realized is that for some participants, for example, KV's participants, the responses were rather thin. So we had to make some of the indications of which role identity was engaged was very clear. And some called for making inferences, and we would like the data to be richer. We don't need to make so many inferences. We can actually see the role identities and their components and structure manifesting in the data. So it's about how to phrase the question and how to prompt and engage the participants in responding to these reflections in ways that will provide richer data. One of the interesting things, by the way, we found out AV, for example, as a participant, only focused on the PD participant. We have other data. We have interviews with these people. We have daily reflections, and we have pre and post PD level activities that provide us additional data. KAV, for example, we found out after we analyzed that this person did not get a teaching position. So they came to the PD without the prospect of going to teach, which makes sense then that this person would have more challenge focusing on imagined role identity as teacher when they didn't have that as a prospect. Another element in response to your question is we realized how much the measures and the activities of reflections that provide us the data are themselves PD activities. So we want to design them so that they enhance and scaffold social and personal identity exploration of those imagined teacher role identities. So by just asking them more generally, what was the high point and low point, we are missing out on opportunity to enhance the PD goals by saying, perhaps triggering, think about your teacher role identity. What are you taking from that? So that's some of the thoughts that we have about changing the measures.
Great, thank you, everybody. So again, I want to say thank you to Serena and Wes, her graduate students, for doing all of that technical behind-the-scenes work that you know by now at this point in the pandemic, you know what it takes to a webinar. So thank you, Serena and Wes, and thank you to Heather and Chessa for joining us as well, our executive team. And we really hope that we see you either virtually at AERA or in person at AERA in San Diego, or at the next webinar, which we have scheduled for August. And we hope to do them every quarter for the next year or so. Thank you so much, and I'm going to hand it back to Serena.
Thank you for participating. I'm going to drop my email address in the chat, so if you do have any thoughts or ideas, suggestions, if you would like to be a presenter at one of our future upcoming webinars, we've got the next, I think, 2 or 3 lined up, but then we're always looking for more names. The more people that are interested in doing a webinar, the more often we can have them. So with that, from all over the world, thank you. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, evening, morning, and we'll hang back for a few minutes in case anybody does have any lingering questions. Otherwise, have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
presenters.
Thank you.
Thanks, guests.